Oh, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
I like the sore loserman hat.
Well, I don't want to talk about this first. Well, I'll circle back to it, but I did do my piece in Politico last week about primary challenges on the left and right, and I mentioned Marcos at Daily Kos, still crows that we kicked Lieberman out of the party in 2006, and I had the temerity to mention, yeah, but he still won that race, and then was kind of a bigger jackass afterwards because he had no obligation to cater to the liberal base of the party. So this is my homage to the great Ned Lamont, the 2006 primary, and of course, always a reminder to the youngins out there that if you stay home because you feel morally pure, you don't vote for establishment types like Al Gore. Sometimes bad things happen in the aftermath.
Yeah, if they have no natural predators, bad things happen. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill. Didn't Marcos Malitzis appear in a TV ad for Ned Lamont, or is that just my recollection?
I don't remember. That wouldn't shock me. The one thing I do remember, because it involves me, because I wasn't pro Lieberman at the time, and Lieberman had an ad towards the end of the campaign, at the end of the Democratic primary against Ned Lamont, where he's like, Ned Lamont doesn't have any ideas. All he has to say is "No more Joe," and they show a bumper sticker like that's like a Lamont bumper sticker. It says "No more Joe," and this is how bad that Lieberman campaign was in the primary. They have a URL address on this fake bumper sticker.
You told us this story last week.
Oh, I did. See, I don't remember things. I don't remember things.
We're like that old married couple. I'm sorry, for those who didn't listen last week, go ahead.
It was quickly, I checked the URL address. It was not a Lamont address. It was an anti-Joe Arpaio address, and I called them out, and that became a bit of a news story. Lieberman had this fake address, and then he lost the primary, which is obviously all due to me. But again, he did win the general, and we should not forget that part of the story.
Indeed. So speaking of people, primary challenges and pushing out incumbents, Jeff Flake. We hardly knew ye.
So here's what I don't get. Jeff Flake, he really sticks his neck out there. He writes an entire book critical of Trump. He's clearly trying to blaze a path of substantively. He wants the Republican Party to remain a free trade party, a pro-immigration reform party, a civil party. Clearly, he's not making headway amongst fellow Arizona Republicans. His poll numbers are terrible. But you've planted your flag and saying we need to speak up. So how does that logically follow into quitting? Quitting is the opposite of speaking up.
I disagree. I'm hearing that a lot from people. I don't think that there's any sort of disconnect for what happened with Flake. I mean, he has spoken out very publicly, critical of Donald Trump. He wrote a book very critical of Trump and Trumpism. He gave a speech on the Senate floor after announcing his, retirement is the right word. That was very pointed. But he was going to lose. He was going to lose that race. And probably what would have happened is either Kelly Ward, who is this Steve Bannon-esque, Roy Moore-esque, right-wing nationalist, populist, conservative, she would have probably beaten him. And then she would have probably lost to a Democrat, and or she would have won, and we would have had another Roy Moore. So I actually think that there's nothing inconsistent. Jeff Flake is standing up to Trump, and I also think he did the right thing. If you want to beat back the forces of Bannonism, now there's a chance for someone like a Martha McSally, a more mainstream conservative congresswoman, to get in that race, win the primary, and then I think she can win the general.
But there is a third option here. I mean, there's the Lieberman option. There's the Murkowski option. You run in the Republican primary. You stand your ground against incivility, conspiracy theories, allergy to facts. You probably lose the primary. You say, this cause is so important, I'm going to run as an independent and prove that you could win running up the middle, as Lieberman and Murkowski did in their races. If you're in the fight, if you're these things are so important.
Yeah, I'm skeptical. Well, and first of all, he's going to be there for the next 14 months, so he can certainly have a voice and a vote for the next 14 months. I'm not convinced. Look, I do think it's fair to say that Jeff Flake may not be a fighter in that way, and that's fine, right? He may not be up for the fight, but I don't think this is a sign of like cowardice or weakness or anything like that. I'm not convinced that he could win an independent campaign or a write-in campaign or anything like that, despite the fact that he's an incumbent. Part of it is just, frankly, that it's not just the Republican base. It's just not just a small portion of the Republican base. I mean, I think that Arizona and the country is becoming more populist, and just Jeff Flake's style of conservatism is out of vogue right now.
Well, isn't that the point? This is a surrender. This is admitting my view of the Republican Party is not the Republican Party. This is really no longer a place for people like me to be in. We cannot win elections in the party as it's currently constructed, and there's not much I can do to change that fact.
Okay, I mean, in that sense, I would agree with it. I mean, surrender obviously has a negative connotation, meaning I'm not going to do anything else to fight. I'm not going to do anything else to advance my ideas. I'm going to let Trump walk all over me. I'm just going to roll over and let Trumpism win. I think you could argue that what Flake is doing is actually going to help at least stem the bleeding and possibly beat back a Trumpist candidate named Kelly Ward. But the way you framed it, then I think, yeah, in a sense, he is surrendering. I just see it as I see it a bit more noble. I think
you're in the strategic retreat camp.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I just don't. I mean, maybe he's got other things he's planning to do. He hasn't really said what he's going to do, except speak out generically. I have 14 months in the Senate where I won't be attuned to political considerations, and I can say what I want and vote how I want. But that's literally a temporary period of time. We don't know what his plan is after the fact.
Right.
But
and I do think. I mean, I think it's fair to. I think a couple things are fair to say. Like, I think it's pretty clear that Flake's, Mormon faith informs a lot of his temperament and politics, and the call for civility. I think that that's very consistent with, who he is as a person. So I definitely think that he was out of step. I think he had voted with Trump like 92% of the time or something like that. I mean, some of this is a temperamental sort of thing.
But I hear this on the left a lot, that Flake's a phony and Corker's a phony because they make these criticisms and they vote for Trump all the time. And I don't think that's really fair, because their criticisms are not about the lion's share of the Trump agenda or the Republican agenda. I mean, the things they've been voting on so far are really just more of traditional Republican agenda.
Right.
Flake has made specific criticisms about Trump on trade and immigration. There haven't been votes on those things.
Right. But it's fair to say that those are two, if you had to create a list of populist nationalist priorities, and if Steve Bannon were putting it together, those would be like the top two.
Well, right. I mean, those are the things I think that Flake really wants to. I mean, he wants to joust on the broader civility, fealty to truth question, but more substantively, he wants in Flake's telling, a true conservative party that's conservative on trade in terms of free market principles, and applying those free market principles to immigration. We want to attract people and not build walls, and the Matt Lewis brand of immigration reform,
which calls into question the definition of conservative too, though.
Right.
I mean, for most of my lifetime, being, pro free trade has been part of the, conservative dogma or whatever.
Right.
But it's not necessarily a quote unquote conservative position. And in the past, in different times, has been, the opposite of that.
Well, I mean, you go back to 19th century and early 20th century protectionism. I mean, the origin of it. You go back to John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson's time. The protectionists were those trying to build up American manufacturers.
Right.
So if you were a modernizer, if you were a business friendly modernizer, you were a protectionist. If you were an agrarian, more agrarian populist, you're more likely to be a free trader who wanted to see let the farmers sell their crops where they want and not worry about how this affects manufacturers in the North. And that largely is the parameters of the debate up until Coolidge's time and the Great Depression.
Yeah. Does anybody know what the Smoot Hawley? Remember the Ben Stein and Ferris Bueller, right? The famous.
And Al Gore whipped that out against Ross Perot in the famous Larry King NAFTA debate in 1993. I mean, that's always been the free trade argument. Smoot Hawley ruined everything for the Great Depression, and I know there's actually been a debate about how much should you really pin Smoot Hawley, how much should I really blame for what happened there? But
certainly didn't help.
Well, it didn't pull us out of depression. But
anybody know?
But there's a different debate to be had now about modern global trade.
Yeah.
Where even Smoot Hawley doesn't really apply to. I mean, there's certain historical lessons to be had. People don't like to mention that. In FDR's For Freedom speech, which liberals tend to cite as this is sort of the glorious vision of what liberalism should be, untethered to any kind of compromising or moderation. He talks about freedom from want. Freedom from want was not an anti-poverty message; it was a free trade message. There had been a long democratic free trade position. Not Andrew Jackson democratic, but more William Jennings Bryan democratic free trade agrarian populist vision that this was good for the little guy to have open access to global markets. It was good for lower prices and good for selling crops, and not just looking out for a small class of manufacturing executives.
Yeah, and I don't know about selling crops, but if you want to buy some stuff at Walmart.
And that's where there's some parallel to today.
Yeah.
Where there's a legitimate debate on what's best for the public at large. Is it to have low prices, or is it to protect American industry and American jobs? And the general argument is the benefits of lower prices is diffuse. The damage to American jobs is more concentrated in certain areas.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of, are your low prices happening because we're taking advantage of workers abroad?
Domestically, for that matter. But I would say also there's the dignity of work. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, now we're even getting farther flung from.
Yeah. Okay.
But to get back to Flake, my point about Flake is that he is making a case that Trump is violating and undermining conservatism as it should be understood. So It doesn't follow that, hey, Jeff Flake, how dare you not vote more like a liberal when there's Republican bills on the floor? That's not Jeff Flake's point.
This is not, I talked about this last night on Anderson Cooper's show and other people. This is not unique to me. It's not a unique observation. But I think what's happened is that, and by the way, for years, as you know, I've been saying that we're conflating anger with ideology, that the definition of a conservative has nothing to do with where you fall philosophically on the right to life or the Second Amendment. It's who was the angriest, right? And was it Congressman Massey who said that he was sort of a libertarian Republican, and he said, I used to think that people were voting for me because of my libertarian positions. And then I realized, no, they were voting for me because I was the craziest son of a bitch on the ballot. And now Trump is the craziest son of a bitch on the ballot. So, there's this line about Adlai Stevenson. Mm-hmm. Someone came up to him and said, every right-thinking person I know is supporting you.
The thinking people are with you.
Is that what it was? And he said, but I need a majority.
Right.
And so the bottom line is this is where the conservative base is, regardless of what is conservative or not. But the thing with Donald Trump is, normally you would think that what matters is legislative victories. Like, is he putting points on the board? Is he passing healthcare reform? Is he passing, tax reform? But in fact, what his supporters are more concerned about is not legislative victories, it's a culture war. So when he gets rid of Flake, that's a victory. Like, that to them is tantamount to passing landmark legislation. When he goes after the NFL, that to them is like repealing Obamacare. That's the theory, at least.
So let's, and you've written about that. I had my own piece of Politico, the culture war president. That was a few weeks ago. Folks want to look back at that.
Oh, you know what?
Yeah.
Maybe you're the one who came up with this idea originally.
There's been a few people. There's been a few people who've done that sort of piece, but I do have one of them. I do recommend it.
I would be the first person, let's just say, to have borrowed an idea from Bill Scher, but didn't,
But to that point, so not only has Trump gone after Flake, he's going after Bob Corker. So Corker had already said he's not running for re-election. Corker had already said, I don't want to vote for a tax bill that's going to be a big deficit creator. So here you are. Tax reform is now the Republican and presidential priority. They just passed, well, actually, they haven't quite passed. I mean, the House and Senate have passed versions of a budget resolution. I believe the House is going to take up the Senate resolution as it is, or they're trying to. But the Senate version of the budget resolution, understand, budget resolutions are not law. They don't get signed by the president. They're effectively guidelines. They're supposed to be guidelines to the rest of the appropriations process. But you pass them in part. One of the things that they can do is be a vehicle for budget reconciliation, which is a parliamentary procedure that allows you to pass certain things without having 60 Senate votes. It's not subject to filibuster. So when you pass the budget resolution, you include reconciliation instructions that cue up your ability to pass a reconciliation bill down the line. So this resolution, in the Senate version of it, says, in this 10-year budget window, we can increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion. And so under reconciliation rules, that says you can pass a reconciliation bill that can't be filibustered that increases the deficit by $1.5 trillion within this 10-year window, but it can't increase the deficit beyond that window. So that's a little tricky. So if you're Corker, and you've already said you're not going to vote for a tax bill that's a big deficit creator, assuming you mean what you say, you're probably not going to vote for a reconciliation bill that includes tax cuts that amount to $1.5 trillion over 10 years, unless he flip-flops, which is always possible. But if you're Trump or you're Mitch McConnell, you got to at least be worried about that sort of thing so much as you care about passing tax reform legislation.
And I think, as others have pointed out, I mean, if Flake and Corker and McCain, three people that Donald Trump has in the past week explicitly attacked,
right?
If they were to form a cabal,
that's it,
and just say, you know what, we really want to do tax reform, but not at the cost of raising the deficit. We just can't in good it's over.
Well, look, and this is just three random people who are mad at Donald Trump. John McCain did vote against the Bush tax cuts because they were budget busters. Jeff Flake has been a real scourge on fiscal spending.
Oh, yeah. He had like 100% Club for Growth rating as a House member.
Right. And Corker is on the record before this most recent flap saying he doesn't want to vote for a deficit-busting tax bill. So, Donald Trump's tweeting against him has not just been, I'm mad at Corker for this or that. He's explicitly criticizing Corker on tax cuts.
Yes. But let me go back to my last point, which is to say that So ostensibly, one of the reasons to do tax reform or tax cuts in this case is to stimulate the economy, to help create jobs. So in that regard, Trump would obviously benefit from passing something. If the economy is doing well, he's more likely to get reelected. But if you put that aside, because that's a hypothetical sort of situation anyway, Trump's supporters don't really care if tax reform passes, as long as he's fighting the cost reform.
Well, that's why my assumption here, to the extent I can apply rational thought to Trump's actions, and maybe that is a fool's game, why would you attack Corker knowing his vote is in jeopardy and is possibly necessary? I think the logical conclusion is you don't expect it to pass, and you want to affix the blame to somebody else now, so you don't get the blame later.
Now, let me say something about Bob Corker, and I'll premise, I'll have the caveat here, which I've had on everything I've said today, which is this isn't just original to me. A lot of conservatives have been making this point, but I think it's worth repeating. Bob Corker is no hero. This is a guy who, when Donald Trump needed credibility, gave it to him. And he was considered for vice president. He was considered for, I think, Secretary of State. He lent legitimacy and credibility to Donald Trump when he needed that. And he didn't. And he didn't say. And when other people like Mitt Romney were speaking out, sounding the alarm about Donald Trump, he would come in and say, like, I just think that we need to, the American people are fed up. He basically defended Trump and gave him cover. Yeah. I got to work on my Bob Corker impersonation, but like, who cares? Like, there's not time. It's unnecessary at this point. But I can't even do that. I don't know what it is. That's the wrong accent. That's more of a Sessions. Anyway,
you need more of a droopy dog kind of accent, I think.
And it's kind of low and southern. Is it more like a?
But his accent's not that thick, and you got to mumble more.
Can you do?
No, I'm not going to go there.
Wouldn't.
I'm not going to go there.
Lower yourself.
No.
Do it. I would. Here's my point. When it mattered, Corker didn't say a damn word. And in fact, Bob Corker never sounded the alarm. Apparently now he's afraid that Donald Trump could start World War III and is a horrible example for the youths of America. But at the time, didn't say a word until Donald Trump personally attacks him on Twitter, personally, and B, he is now not running for re-election.
Well, all these people, I mean, no one who is on the line in 2018 is speaking up. These are all people who have nothing to lose. And, just the most recent attempt at a bipartisan compromise, Alexander Murray, all the Republican co-sponsors for that are people who are not up for re-election in 2018. So,
But Flake had something to lose until 12 hours.
He did.
So I give him credit
right.
for that.
By
the way, Ala Pundit, sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting. Ala Pundit at Hot Air did write an interesting piece about when does Ben Sass decide he can't run. I mean, 2020 is going to be here before you know it.
Right. So, but Matt Lewis was a never Trump conservative, is concerned that Trump is ruining conservatism. Corker is now someone who is, belatedly joining the team. I mean, to the extent that you do want to see conservatism protected in the long run from Trump, is it bad to get an extra person on the squad?
Yeah, that's the dilemma, right? Like, do you welcome converts with open arms and like it's all is forgotten, all is forgiven? I say no. I say I want to hold these people accountable. I'm keeping score. I'm paying attention, and that's where I'm at.
And I mean, if you're a never Trump conservative, do you want this tax bill passed? Because most conservatives, I mean, there are deficit hawk conservatives and there are supply side tax cut conservatives who don't care about they're not bean counters. They think you just do a big tax cut that will spark economic growth and it'll all work out in the end. Dick Cheney deficits don't matter. So this is the last thing that conservatives could hope to get through the Congress by November 2018. Would you rather see conservatives abandon Trump because Trump is a virus that's killing conservatism, or do you want people to shut up and figure out how to get this bill passed, because that at least would be something you could pocket?
I think that good never Trumpers could disagree on this, but my philosophy is you should vote on a bill based on its merits. And while, number one, there isn't a bill, but there's a framework. And based on what I've seen, it's not perfect, but I would vote for this.
You would vote for a tax cut. So you'd vote for something that's not revenue neutral tax reform, which was the initial idea. They've now said, oh, you know what? That's too complicated. There's too many winners and losers. We're never gonna get the votes for that. Let's old fashioned. Just give them some money. Here you go. 1.5 trillion over 10 years. Have a ball. That's what you want to see.
What I would like to see is to cut spending. Also cut taxes.
But you're not going to get that.
You're not going to do that. So I would do this anyway. Yes, I would. I would do this because I do believe that if you cut, especially the corporate tax, you do some of the other, repatriation, other things like that, that it could, probably will create growth, grow the economy, create jobs. I think that the pros will so I'm not just doing it for political reasons, like we need to pass something. Overall, not perfect. I think it's probably better than not doing it. So I would vote for it, regardless of whether it helps Trump, hurts Trump, or whatever.
So that's the Matt Lewis ideal.
That's me.
Within the bounds of reality. Now,
but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a conspiracy among a collusion to find reasons that this bill is never quite good enough.
Well, that might be a Rand Paul position. I mean, even in this last meeting, the Senate lunch, probably Trump said, "Hey, Rand Paul, you're with us on taxes," and Rand Paul was like, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." But Rand Paul's always been a prickly senator. He always finds a way to vote no. Unless
it doesn't matter, he'll vote yes if it's not going to pass. But if you need him, never quite good enough.
Right, and he might not be the fulcrum here, because if you lose Flake, McCain, Corker, and you always lose Susan Collins. She's not someone you can rely upon. And I think there's probably another handful of deficit hawks out there that you may not be able to trust. So it might not come down to Paul. Are you enough of a compromiser, Matt Lewis, where if it's clear the votes aren't there for a deficit increasing tax cut, would you say to Trump, look, you got to pass something, you got to do some kind of revenue raise to get revenue neutral, or at that point you say that's a violation of my supply side conservative principles, you just got to let this die?
I mean, I would still fight to cut spending. I do think, and I know this sounds like a cop-out, but I do think that the way that the CBO or whoever will probably score this will be static. And so it's going to look like it's going to raise the deficit more than it actually will, because it won't count for the growth.
Right. I think Corker has given himself wiggle room there. He's not saying let's be slavishly loyal to the CBO. I think he's accepting of some degree of anticipating economic growth. He just doesn't want to go overboard with it. And where he draws that line, we can't know.
That's right. And I think that if you could make a perfectly plausible and respectable argument that we need tax cuts, we need tax reform, but not if we're going to basically grow the deficit and have no. I mean, Mick Mulvaney, the budget director, has basically said deficits are good. He's flip-flopped on this. We need to grow the deficit, and there's no way we're going to cut spending. I've given up on that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said.
I'm going to do a total digression here before I segue into some of your other work for this week. As you may know, Matt Lewis, very sad day yesterday. Robert Guillaume passed away.
Benson, yes,
legendary Benson. You know, we have a hard time now accepting, you know, Bill Cosby's role in pop culture and race relations because of the recent accusations. Robert Guillaume never suffered those sorts of accusations, but he had a role in 1980s television.
Yeah, he went from being a butler to being the lieutenant governor.
That's right. And in my own personal homage to Robert Guillaume late last night, I rewatched the episode where he becomes budget director. So in between becoming, he went from butler on Soap. And by the way, everyone should just go binge watch Soap right now. That's one of the greatest shows in the history of television. But he graduated from Soap to his own show, Benson, where he becomes the head groundskeeper at the governor's mansion. And then from there, Governor Gatling makes the audacious move to take the groundskeeper and make him budget director. This was this controversial move that he was making. And one of the chair of the committee that approved the nomination goes to the governor and says, "Hey, why aren't you picking my boy, my House Representative so-and-so? He's much more qualified for the job. You can't pick the guy who, you know, runs the governor's mansion." And the governor refuses to back down. The state legislature says, "I'm going to bury him in my committee." Benson goes to the committee. The chair of the committee then brings up an arrest on his record for armed robbery in 1952.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Benson then proceeds to tell the story how he was hitchhiking and ended up in a car with someone who was pretending to be a nun who was an armed robber, and when the cops pulled him over, like she put the gun in his hand and he got arrested, but it all got sorted out. He wasn't charged. Or wasn't convicted, and then he does a whole, you know, "Have you no decency, sir?" kind of speech, and he storms out of the hearing room, and then it still becomes budget director. So,
was I right that he ends up lieutenant governor?
Well, he ends up lieutenant governor
at the end of it,
then in the very last episode, it's one of my most what I'm most angry about in my pop culture life. The very last episode of Benson. He's running for governor because Governor Gatling was perceived to be term limited. But then his aide figures out that since he had one term as a member of a party, one term as an independent, the provision in the state constitution didn't apply, and he could run. And so he ends up running against Benson, and there's a third person in the race. And then the very last scene is Benson and Governor Gatling making up as the returns are coming in, and you don't hear what the result is. And
so you've invested how many years of your life?
And then the show got canceled. And by the way, I should also point out that Soap also ended ambiguously because it got canceled. And when you binge watch that show, you end up not knowing what the hell actually happens.
But I mean, Soap was intentionally supposed to be like a soap opera, so they always had to have a cliffhanger.
Right.
Benson, not the same conceit.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
So that's even more egregious that this happened.
Absolutely.
Actually, I have to leave in about 5.
Okay. Well, we should talk about your other important work then.
Well, I would just recommend. So I interviewed 2 Gold Star parents in the past 2 days.
Not just any random Gold Star parents, mind you. Cindy Sheehan, who famously stood up to George Bush during the Iraq War, and then I think she ran for something
in California.
Yeah, I forget it was governor or vice president or something or other. But she went kind of Green Party, and very critical of Democrats as well as Republicans. And also Andrew Bacevich, who is a known public intellectual on foreign policy. I wouldn't call him isolationist. Seems too harsh, but he's very skeptical about foreign intervention.
Really fascinating conversations with both of them. I would say with Cindy Sheehan, the most interesting thing I think that came from that is I was asking her about the line, you know, he knew what he signed up for. And she argues that military recruiters mislead, especially working class recruits, you're not going to be in you'll never see any real fighting. You're just going to get your college paid for, which seems kind of plausible to me, or at least what they emphasize seems plausible.
Well, maybe they can't play that card as much now. You could pre 9/11 perhaps. I don't know how much you can get away with. Nothing's going on.
And I would say the Andrew Bacevich interview also equally interesting. That one is a podcast. You can go to Matt Lewis in the News on iTunes, and I talked to him for about a half hour, covered a lot of stuff, and including his interest in national service, mandatory national service. Not everybody would have to be in the military, but everyone would have to serve 2 years, serve their country. Could be in like a Peace Corps type situation, or but bringing the country together, having sort of a shared responsibility. I think it's an interesting idea.
But were either of them sympathetic to Trump? Because Trump is known as being somewhat skeptical about foreign intervention, although we're hearing a lot of bluster, of course, with North Korea. But he is not someone who has stoled himself as someone who's a neocon adventurer. So did you get anything from Bacevich or Sheehan to say, you know what, this is better than the hawkishness the Democratic Party was pursuing in the last 8 years?
No, both of them thought that the story about LaDavid Johnson and Maisha and the phone call, while important, was overshadowing the larger problem of us being in Niger and nobody knowing that we were there or why we were there. And so they were both much more concerned not about the story that cable news has been obsessed with, but about the larger story about foreign interventionism. That was really, I think, both of them really stressed that Cindy Sheehan was not happy with the fact that George W. Bush, people are now sort of fondly remembering George W. Bush and comparing him favorably to the horrible guy we've got now, Trump. Cindy Sheehan did not like that. Bacevich was Colonel Bacevich, Dr. Bacevich is very, very critical of Trump, but he believes, having said that, despite being very critical of Trump, he believes that part of the reason we're so focused on the phone call with the Gold Star widow is that the Democrats are basically trying to score political points. It's the Benghazi, getting revenge for Benghazi. So very interesting conversations, and I wrote about both of them at the Daily Beast. So if you go check out my column at the Daily Beast, you can read both of them. I found it to be very interesting and informative for me to talk to people that I obviously don't agree with entirely, but we had very civil conversations, and I think they brought up some interesting ideas.
I'll do one semi-self-promotional thing before we sign off. So last week I talked about the Urge to Purge piece of Politico about the primary challenges on the left and the right. Graham Weiss at the New Republic picked up that thread, wrote a really a rebuttal piece, but he specifically in terms of the Dianne Feinstein challenge. And he talked to, I was critical of Marcos over at Daily Kos and the folks at Democracy for America because they egged on Kevin DeLeon to challenge Feinstein. Graham talked to them, got their rebuttals to me, and caution over both of us, he watched our last show and quoted me in the show. Just so you know, people are watching. You know,
be careful what we say.
This is an on-the-record environment. You better get your act together.
Be careful what we say. And I would also say a lot of really important, smart people watch this show. So it's a cautionary tale, but it's also flattering.
Exactly, but Graham is a great reporter, and he's doing a lot of good work as far as like covering what's going on with the left, and there's a lot to be said there. So he's a good guy to read over the New Republic.
Awesome. All right, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Follow us at DMZ Show on Twitter, and check us out back here in the DMZ next week.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.